Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic will be traps and tricks in the Caro-Kann defense. If you're new to chess, you may wonder, what is the Caro-Kann? Well, there are a whole bunch of different chess openings. I always like to say that openings for a beginner, novice player are not very important at all. And I have not changed my mind on that. However, I thought it's a good way to show you some tactics that may be typical for the Caro-Kann. And let's start with our first short little example. White played e4 and black played c6. After these two moves, the game is considered a Caro-Kann defense. Black's response with the c-pawn to c6, one square up, against white's king-pawn to e4 start is already defined as the Caro-Kann. You may wonder, what is the purpose of black's move? Well, the purpose is to follow up on the next move by playing the d-pawn to d5. You may wonder, why didn't black do that right away? Well, black certainly could have done that without loss of material, as after pawn takes, the black queen is able to capture back and keep the material balance. However, I have mentioned it perhaps in some of the other lessons that you heard already, that it's not a great idea to bring the queen out early in the game. And the reason being that the queen can easily be attacked if it comes out too early. Let's go back all the way to the beginning. And e4, our subject in this lesson is when black plays c6. So now back to the question, why does black play c6? What's the idea? It is to prevent the black queen needing to capture back on d5. So for example, after white would play d4 and black would respond with d5, if now white would choose to capture black's pawn on d5, then the black pawn from c6 could capture back, not needing for the black queen to come out. After black's last move, white needs to react to the usual question, which is, what does my opponent want to do? And in this case, that threat is to the pawn on e4. The black d5 pawn wants to capture white's e4 pawn. White has a number of options. As usual, when a piece is attacked, that may move away, in this case, to advance to e5. The pawn can be protected in various ways, as we shall see, or we may capture our attacker, which would be pawn takes pawn on d5 in this case. Well, white continued by protecting the pawn with the knight on c3. And black captured the pawn anyway on e4, and the knight captured back on e4. And in this position, black has a number of very frequently tried moves. One is, for example, playing bishop to f5, attacking white's knight, when the most common and best response would be to retreat the knight to g3, but by gaining time, because at the same time that we move the knight, we're attacking black's bishop right away. Another typical option here would be to play knight d7, which we shall see in one of the other games. However, in this game, after white captured back on e4, black continued by playing knight f6. Of course, just like at every move, we need to ask ourselves the question, what is our opponent's plan or threat? And there is one in this case, certainly. The black knight that has just developed is looking to capture our beautifully centralized knight on e4. So again, as so often, we need to choose from one of the three options to simply run away, to capture our attacker or protect our attacked piece. In this case, I think clearly the best option is to capture our attacker, because that forces black in this position to capture back with one of his two pawns. And regardless which one black chooses, whether the G pawn or the E pawn, to capture back, it means that black ends up having doubled pawns, meaning that the two pawns on the F file that black has, one top of another, restrict the pawn that's behind, that is the F7 pawn, and that's considered a little bit of a disadvantage. And white right now continued by playing bishop c4, which perhaps wasn't the most accurate move. Developing with the knight to f3 may have been a better option. And this is an unusual situation when it is a good idea to delay the development of the bishop and take advantage of a tactical opportunity. When the bishop has developed to c4, we can notice that that piece right now is on an unprotected square. It doesn't seem to matter at the moment because there is no black piece that could capture it. However, black had a tricky opportunity to cause trouble for white. And black responded by playing queen to e7. I'd like to stress that generally this is not a good-looking move because it positions the black queen right in front of black's dark-squared bishop. However, in the meantime, it puts white in a check, and white needs to react to that. White in the game made a big mistake by moving the bishop to e3, blocking the check. It seems to be an okay choice. The problem is now that the fact that the bishop on c4 is unprotected will play a significant role. Can you see the move that black should do right now? Well, if you had queen b4 in mind, you were certainly right, because this is not only a check, but at the same time it also attacks the bishop on c4, and white can only react to the check and has to give up on the bishop that's on c4. Let's go back just a couple of moves here and see what other options white had. Well, if white would choose the other natural developing move to block the check with the knight on e2, it would result with a similar response, queen b4, again winning the bishop on c4. So that wouldn't solve white's problems. So white has a few other choices. Of course, moving the king out to f1 avoids losing material. However, it voluntarily would give up on the right to castle, and there is certainly no need for that at this stage. A better option would be to block the check with the queen, in which case black could either trade queens or, for example, play bishop e6, but queen b4 is certainly not allowed because the black queen is pinned at this moment, is not allowed to leave the e-file. So queen e2 would be certainly a reasonable choice, or another playable move would be to retreat the bishop. Of course, that's some kind of a concession from white, admitting that a retreat is necessary. However, it's certainly much better than blocking with the other bishop, which results in losing the c4 bishop. At this stage, black would need to hurry up and develop his dark-squared bishop and castle as soon as possible. Black could achieve that by playing g6, follow it up by developing the bishop on g7, and then be ready to castle once there is no other piece in between black's king and rook. So here the key element was that white had to be very careful by putting his bishop on c4, making sure not to allow for a black queen to end up forking white's king and bishop. Let's move on to our second example, which starts out the same exact way with the Caro Kann defense. However, white chose a different approach, playing c4, still having in mind a similar idea to provoke the black queen to come out too early so it could be attacked. Black responded with d5, white captured, black pawn captured back, and the white pawn captured again. So here the idea is that if the black queen gets out to d5, then the white knight again is ready to come out to c3 to attack black's queen. Therefore, black chose instead to develop with the knight in hopes to next capture white's pawn on d5 with a knight and not with the queen. White right now continued by playing bishop b5 check. It doesn't matter that the black king cannot move out of the check. Black has numerous ways to block it, and the best of them is to do it with the bishop, offering an exchange of the light-squared bishops. If indeed white would now trade on d7 the bishops, black could capture back with the queen, and then white certainly would be helpless in hanging on to the pawn on d5. White tried to hang on to it by playing bishop to c4. Now the bishop protects the pawn on d5, and black played a very tricky move, namely queen to c7, attacking the bishop on c4, with the idea that, for example, if white just moves the bishop back, then again there is a forking idea a bit similar to what we saw in the first game, namely that the knight could capture on d5, even though the bishop seemingly is protecting it and now can capture black's knight. Black would respond with a forking check, and then after white responds to the attack to the king by blocking that check or moving the king, then the queen would simply capture white's bishop. So let's go back just a tiny bit. After queen c7, white continued in the game by playing queen to b3, protecting not only the bishop but indirectly through an X-ray also the pawn on d5. Or at least so it seems. Reality is that queen b3 was a major mistake. And again, the key element is that the bishop on c1 has been left unprotected. But how can black take advantage of it when the bishop cannot be captured right away? Well, the brilliant move that takes advantage of this mistake is black playing b5, attacking the bishop on c4, and if that bishop moves away, even if it captures the pawn on b5, then the other bishop on c1 will be captured with a check, and more importantly, for free. In the game that was played in Copenhagen in 1996 between two Danish masters, white played knight a3, at least trying to minimize the damage. Black, of course, now has to capture the bishop. Otherwise, on the following move, white's bishop could run away, as now the white rook already protects the bishop. So, of course, black happily captures the bishop on c4. White captured back with the knight, and that allowed black to also capture a pawn with knight d5. It's true that that knight on d5 is on an unprotected square right now. However, white has no way to take advantage of that situation. Therefore, continued by developing, and so did black, and the game ended shortly as black was up a knight. On a higher level, masters or grandmasters typically would resign if they got into a situation when their opponent has an extra piece. Of course, at a novice level, that's still not a reason to resign a game. However, nevertheless, we can evaluate the position as black having a clear material advantage. Let's see our next example in this lesson, which is one of the most typical Caro Kann opening traps. It started out like our first example in this lesson with e4, c6, d4, d5, knight develops protecting the pawn, takes, and in this game not knight f6 as we saw in the first game, but knight to d7. The idea is to prepare the knight f6 development, so after white would trade the knights, black will not be forced to capture back with a pawn and double up pawns on the f-file, but could recapture with the knight from d7 to f6. And white made a very tricky move, not a good move objectively, but an extremely tricky move by playing queen e2. The reason why it's not such a great idea, because it steps right in front of white's bishop on f1, so if black doesn't fall for the trap, then in reality this was not an ideal move for white. Well, black fell for the trap in this game and developed the knight to f6, allowing a checkmate in just one move. And that one move is knight d6. And because of the pin that the queen created along the e-file, black cannot capture the knight, and therefore this is checkmate. So what should have black done instead? Well, the correct response would have been to play e6. Now there is no knight d6 as the black bishop happily guards that square, and then on the following move the black knight will also come out to f6 and black can continue with development. Let's see another game that was actually played between grandmasters. Again, the starting moves are identical, Caro Kann, and d4, d5, knight c3, pawn takes, knight takes, and knight d7. So far identical to our last example, but in this game Grandmaster Kann played an objectively lot more sound move, namely knight to g5. You may wonder what's the point of this move, and after black's response it gets demonstrated brilliantly. Black played the natural-looking h6, kind of asking the knight, what are you doing there? Where are you going? Go back. Well, obviously, white's plan wasn't to go back, but to go even further ahead. And the British Grandmaster played a very elegant move, knight e6. Of course, I have to add that it's quite rare that in Grandmaster level, and black was the Bulgarian Grandmaster Kirill Georgiev, would fall for such or similar traps. Now, of course, the idea is if pawn captures knight, then all of a sudden white is ready to checkmate with queen h5, when black can only delay the immediate end by blocking it, and then queen captures g6 would result in an immediate checkmate. Going back to the position with knight e6, of course at this point the Grandmaster playing with the black pieces noticed the coming trouble and played queen a5 with a check. Now white has to be very careful, because if white would simply block the check with a pawn, black would be able already to capture the knight on e6 without white even having the option to give a check on h5, as the black queen protects that square perfectly. So let's go back and see how the game continued. White played bishop to d2. Very important move, not only blocking the check, but immediately attacking the black queen. Queen moved back to b6. And now came another important move, when white played bishop to d3. And amazingly, black still is unable to capture the knight, but black realized that just too late. After pawn captured on e6, white has a very sneaky and tricky way to win the black queen. First, by checking on h5, and then, when the king moves to d8, then simply pinning the queen with bishop to a5. A very nice and elegant finish. And here is our final example for this lesson, which was played by the famous Grandmaster Tartakover against Anand in 1932. e4, c6, d4, d5, and in that game white tried a much less popular way to protect the pawn with f3. Black captured, white captured back, and black played a very tricky move, e5. Why is this tricky? Because now, if pawn captures pawn, then the black queen would appear on h4. As the pawn on f2 is missing, this is a check, and then the queen could capture on e4, and white will end up losing the right to castle. And at the same time, black wins back the sacrificed pawn. Let's go back just a tiny bit and see how the game continued with knight f3, protecting the pawn. Pawn captured on d4, and white's idea was not to capture the pawn back, but play in a gambit style, which means sacrificing a pawn, or sometimes two, in order to get quick development and develop an early attack against the opponent's king. White played bishop c4 in trying to get ready to castle. And here black should have been a bit more cautious and developed the bishop only to e7. But black played more ambitiously and gave a check immediately, inviting white to sacrifice another pawn, which white happily did, c3, pawn captures, and now things are getting very tactical and wild. Bishop captured on f7. King captures, which is a mistake. It was better to move the king to e7. Of course, this gives the queen up, but black did that on purpose, in hopes for a discovered check with pawn takes pawn now. White got out of the discovered check, and the pawn get promoted on a1. Now it seems that black has an overwhelming material advantage, which is true. The problem is that his king will get checkmated first. And it's important not to worry about material at this stage, but make forceful moves that lands the opponent's king in checkmate. And the move to accomplish that is to play knight g5, leaving black with only one legal move, moving to g6, and then follow it up with another check, queen e8. Now if the black king moves to the f-file, then white's rook comes into the game and the checkmate will arrive on the following move. And as in the game, when the king went to h6, now even though the white bishop is not moving on c1, but white moves the knight away, and yet the bishop becomes the hero, creating a discovered check. And black can only delay checkmate by one more move, blocking it, and then bishop takes checkmate. Well, with this romantic style, old game, I'd like to say goodbye, and I hope you gained some important ideas that you can use in your own games, especially if your game starts with the Caro Kann, that is e4 and c6. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.